Hey gamers, what's up? Today I want to talk to you about one of my favorite consoles of all time. Something that as a collector and as a gamer, you really should know about if you don't already. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this video because you owe it to yourself to own a 3DO. The 3DO Interactive Multiplayer is one of the greatest unrealized game consoles of all time. And sadly, a lot of people have never even heard of it. Often referred to simply as the 3DO, it was the brainchild of Trip Hawkins. If you don't know that name, in 1982 he was the founder of Electronic Arts and in my opinion, the best man to have ever run the company. In 1991 he left EA to form 3DO in cooperation with AT&T, MCA, Time Warner, venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers, LG, EA, NTG, and Matsushita, who you may also know as Panasonic. On October 4th, 1993, they released the most advanced and most expensive game console of its time. With a list price of $699.99, it had the highest MSRP at launch of any game console ever created, and by today's economic standard, that's equivalent to $1,116.01. Of those who know about the 3DO, many believe it to be the first 32-bit CD-ROM based console, but that's not the fact. The FM Towns Marty was launched about 8 months ahead of the 3DO, but only in Japan. Its price tag was a whopping 66,000 yen. Today, that's equivalent to about $941.97. And the Amiga CD32 was released a month ahead of the 3DO, but only in Europe, Australia, Canada, and Brazil, at a price of $399.99. That's about $637.71 today. And though it wasn't the first of its kind, the 3DO was the first of them to receive a worldwide release, with launches in Japan, Europe, and America, making it the first truly mainstream 32-bit CD-ROM based gaming console. Initially, promotion of the 3DO was strong. It was even voted by Time Magazine Product of the Year. Sadly, despite its cutting-edge technology, the 3DO's high price was a huge obstacle that they found exceptionally hard and in the end, impossible to overcome. Now, at the time of its launch, the 3DO's only real competition was the ill-fated Atari Jaguar, and in the beginning the Jaguar gave the 3DO some stiff competition, mainly due to its lower price tag of $249.99. That's about $398.56 today. But even though the Jaguar was considerably less expensive, its game library lacked solid first-party titles and third-party support. In the end, the Jaguar only sold 250,000 consoles, and the 3DO sold about 5 million, 20 times the number of Jaguar consoles sold. And though some believe the 3DO's third-party support and exclusives were in short number, I'm inclined to disagree. So on that note, let's talk about games and graphics. The 3DO had some really outstanding exclusive titles, many of which went to the Saturn and PlayStation later on. Games like Madden, Need for Speed, Gex, Killing Time, Space Hulk, Slayer, Return Fire, Death Keep, PO'd, Crash and Burn, Twisted the Game Show, Quarantine and Mercenary D, and many more all started off as exclusives on the 3DO. Some of them were never ported over and can only be played on the 3DO to this day. And of the ones that were ported over, I'm still inclined to play them on the 3DO. I just don't think that Gex, PO'd, or D were as good on the PlayStation. And I think that holds true for a lot of the games originally made for the 3DO. The 3DO was also the only console with a port of the original Alone in the Dark. For those of you not familiar with it, this was the first survival horror game ever. And it was also the first game to use fully polygonal characters on top of pre-rendered backgrounds. Needless to say, this game was key in inspiring Capcom, who in creating the first Resident Evil game 4 years later, took a page from Infogrames, using many ideas from Alone in the Dark to create the first of their iconic horror franchise. The 3DO also sported the absolute best versions of Out of This World and Flashback, two of my personal all-time favorite games. One has only to look at these games side by side to see exactly how superior the 3DO versions were in comparison to their 16-bit counterparts in both graphics and sound. I'm not talking a little bit better here, I'm talking vast improvements. But don't just take my word for it. Take a look at this example. The 3DO was also host to the best home console ports of Samurai Showdown and Super Street Fighter II Turbo at the time. Each of these were virtually arcade perfect, with the added bonus that the CD quality sound actually exceeded the sound quality of their original arcade counterparts. Now, it's true that in terms of graphics, the 3DO was not as powerful as the Saturn or PlayStation, partially because the 3DO was released more than a year ahead of them, and also because originally it was constructed more for full motion video than it was 3D graphics. But that doesn't mean there aren't some outstanding polygonal 3D titles for the system, and it certainly doesn't mean that there aren't games with great graphics. In fact, for its day, the 3DO was home to many beautifully done exclusive titles. For example, one of my favorite games on the 3DO was Killing Time. It was a first-person shooter created with a 3D polygonal environment that used full motion video in-game to represent ghosts telling the story of what happened in the mansion. But instead of cutscenes, these ghosts act out a scene right in front of you during gameplay.
We're expecting another shipment of arms.
Well, boss, where am I going to put all this stuff? I mean, the storage room is almost full. I can't even walk in there.
Guess you'll just have to stash it around the grounds.
Well, I don't like it. I mean, booze was one thing, but guns, I don't know.
Quit worrying, Mike. Our new associates from Chicago will be here this evening to take the guns off the island. They will pay us handsomely for the arms. They have new contacts. We can expand. This is only the beginning.
It was really an outstanding and unique idea. Your enemies in the game were made up of digitized sprites based on actors, much like the characters in the original Mortal Kombat titles. They were inserted into the game and it looked like real bad guys were attacking you. As I play it again while making this review, I remember why I loved it so much back then, and still do to this very day. Oh, and talk about hard. I love that games of this era don't hold your hand the way they do now. In fact, I challenge a lot of today's so-called gamers to play through games like these. I think many of them would experience rage quits like never before. Some due to the primitive and admittedly clunky control from many of the games that lack the dual analog we're so spoiled by today, but the rest because games of this time were not made for the faint of heart or those with no patience. These games were made for someone who wants a challenge, someone willing to learn through an excessive amount of trial and error. No golden trails leading you to your next objective, no little arrows on the screen saying, hey, go this way. In these games, you had an objective and maybe a map, and the rest was up to you. When it comes right down to it, the 3DO had many great titles and some outstanding graphics for a game console of its time. But keep in mind, raw graphics processing power is not what makes a console great. Just look at the PlayStation 2, the least powerful of the three contending game consoles of the 6th generation, and it took the world by storm. Remember that when you consider what makes a console truly great, because the 3DO was was definitely a great console. Anyone who says differently simply has not explored the game library that this system has to offer. How many variations of the 3DO were there? First, there were the common ones. The Panasonic FZ1 Real 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. This is the most common and the first of the 3DO consoles launched. It was sold in Japan, Asia, North America, and Europe. This system had a front-loading CD tray and came with a controller featuring a headphone jack and volume control. The Gold Star 3DO Interactive Multiplayer was sold in South Korea, North America, and Europe. It was released a year after the FZ1. It is similar in physical appearance to the FZ1, featuring that front-loading CD design. However, due to hardware differences and file processing limitations, incompatibilities with some games were reported. Its controller was slightly larger than that of the FZ1, but still featured the headphone jack and volume control. The Panasonic FC10 Real 3DO Interactive Multiplayer is the less expensive, slimmed-down, and lighter model that was made to replace the FZ1 and lower its production cost. The FC10 features a top-loading CD tray and internal memory manager. The controller is also smaller and lighter than the one included with the FZ1, but lacks the headphone output and volume control. However, the FZ1 controller will work on the FZ10, as all controllers were compatible with every system. And then there were the rare ones, like the Panasonic Robo 3DO, which was only released in Japan. This was an FZ1 custom console fitted with a 5-disc CD drive. Its look was like that of a component to a home theater or stereo system with a large rectangular design. It was used in hotels for patrons to play 3DO games on a pay-per-use basis. The Gold Star 3DO Alive 2 was a console released only in South Korea and was designed to look something like the original PlayStation console. The Sanyo Tri 3DO Interactive Multiplayer was also a Japan-only console. Its clever, wavy, flowing top makes its design unique amongst all game consoles. To date, I've never seen another system like it. The Creative 3DO Blaster. This is an expansion card in one controller that enables a PC to play 3DO games. This is a brilliant device, and I've been trying to get one at a good price for years. Needless to say, my search continues. There was also an AT&T 3DO prototype. Its design was not unlike that of the Gold Star and FZ1 models, with a front-loading CD tray and single control port on the front bottom. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find any more pictures, so here's a monkey on a bike. The 3DO also had some pretty cool features. One added bonus of the time was that the 3DO included the first light synthesizer in a game console, converting CD music to color patterns on screen. I remember being hypnotized the first time I used it. I'd play music on my 3DO just so I could have that cool display on my TV. Also, the 3DO is one of the few CD-based consoles that have no region lockout or copy protection, which makes it extremely easy these days to pirate games for. Although there is no lockout, there are a few Japanese games that won't play on non-Japanese 3DO consoles due to a special kanji font that English language consoles just can't read. Another cool feature were the controllers. Originally, the 3DO controllers had headphone jacks and volume adjustment, as I mentioned earlier. The console itself only featured a single control port, and rather than plug multiple controllers into the console, each controller had its own control port on top. Extra players could be added to the game by daisy-chaining the controllers together for up to 8 players, without the need for any sort of multi-tap accessory. And all 3DO controllers, no matter what brand, were compatible with one another. There were also some items that a lot of people didn't know about, like the karaoke mixer. This was a cool item that allowed people to use their 3DO to sing karaoke. There was also a 256K memory upgrade. It was only released in Japan, but works on American and European consoles as well. This was the best way to expand the limited 32 kilobyte memory that was standard in the 3DO. The other was using the save compressor that the Game Guru offered. Oh yeah, and the Game Guru. Any of you who have used a Game Genie Action Replay or Game Shark get the premise of this game-enhancing item. As far as I know, it's the only cheat device you can find for the 3DO. And it has an added bonus. You can use it to compress save files so you don't have to delete them to make extra space on your console. There was also a video CD module released for the 3DO that allowed it to play, yep, you guessed it, video CDs. One was made for each of the more common 3DO models. The Gold Star version was the only one to be released in the United States. Both Panasonic versions were released in Japan. These expansion modules allowed people to play VCDs on their systems, kind of like a VCR entertainment system of some sort for their home. And it made the system a lot more desirable to those who wanted multimedia functionality. At this point, you're probably saying to yourself, well, if it had so many great games and they looked so good and played so well, how could it have been a failure? What caused it to crash and burn? Well, there were many factors that played into the demise of the 3DO. A lot of the games for it were based on full motion video rather than 3D graphics. You see, for a time in the early 90s, developers thought that was going to be the future of gaming. So games like Corpse Killer, Demolition Man, Crime Patrol, Snow Job, Night Trap, and similar titles are a dime a dozen on this console. However, as the newer consoles came out, 3DO realized a little bit too late that full motion video was not the way of the future. Also, the home game console market in the mid-90s was totally oversaturated. First off, we have to consider that the Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and Super Nintendo were all still in production when the 5th generation of gaming began. Of the new consoles, there were 4 that were real contenders. You had the 3DO, PlayStation, Saturn, and Nintendo 64. But this was also a generation where we saw the release of the previously mentioned FM Towns Marty and Amiga CD32, as well as the Apple Pippin, Neo Geo CD, Casio Loopy, Virtual Boy, Bandai Playdia, PCFX, Sega 32X, Atari Jaguar, and the Jaguar CD, most of which actually hit American store shelves. And though not all of these consoles were released in every region, each had an impact on the gaming scene and industry in their own individual regions, and consumers were bombarded with game systems all over the world, which didn't help any of them. This was a generation of failed consoles. In fact, as far as I can tell, the 5th generation saw the launch of more home game consoles around the world than any other. So gaining a foothold was going to be difficult for anyone, and with the 3DO's ridiculously high launch price of $699.99, people were not climbing over one another to get one, especially for that first year when the Jaguar seemed like it may work out and the consumer could snag one for $450 less than the 3DO. So, why was it so expensive? Well, 3DO's objective was to create a next-generation 32-bit CD-ROM based home game console that also served as a high-end audio-video entertainment system. The idea was that it would be manufactured by various partners and licensees. 3DO would collect a royalty on each console sold and each game manufactured. In turn, 3DO offered game publishers a very low $3 royalty rate per game, which was much better than Nintendo and Sega were giving to developers at the time. This licensing method is why the 3DO was available from all those different manufacturers. However, this is what also made the system so expensive. The manufacturers had to make a profit on the hardware itself, unlike other hardware manufacturers like Sega and Sony, who sell their systems making nearly no profit at all, with plans of making up the loss they took on hardware with software and accessory sales. This is one area in which the 3DO's business model was really flawed. The console was just too expensive for the average consumer. In 1994, Gold Star and Sanyo released their renditions of the 3DO, and Panasonic also updated from the original FZ1 front-loading model to the FZ10 top-loading model at a lower price of $399.99. This new price was intended to be more competitive now that the announcement of the lower-priced PlayStation had been made. But it was still $100 more expensive, and once the PlayStation hit store shelves, it was not hard for it to start gaining ground on the 3DO's not-so-huge installed base. If 3DO and their partners had implemented this price drop to coincide with the launch of the PlayStation and matched the price of the soon-to-be juggernaut, they could have had a chance. The console already had some momentum from its more than 1 year head start, actually 1 year and 11 months in America. and a price drop to match the PlayStation would have drawn consumers into the idea of owning the advanced piece of equipment that had previously been out of their reach. Sadly, they didn't do this, and as the 3DO went under, third-party developers jumped ship and the support needed for success just wasn't there. With a growing game library, lower price, and fantastic third-party support, the PlayStation was on its way to achieving video game greatness, while the 3DO could do nothing but sit idly by and watch their dreams collapse all around them. Eventually, they ended up selling their own exclusives off one by one to be ported over to the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. The 3DO system was discontinued at the end of 1996 with a complete shutdown of all internal hardware development. But I will maintain this. To call the 3DO a complete failure is not entirely accurate. Sure, it tanked, and 3DO lost the race, but if you really think about it, the 3DO didn't do too bad securing a 4th place position in a gaming generation that saw the release of at least 15 game consoles within 3 years of one another. And only 2 consoles of the 5th gen, the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, sold over 10 million units. This was a tough time for anyone to release a game console. Marketing and price seemed to be key in success. Unfortunately, 3DO didn't do either very well. Originally, the M2 was meant to be an attachment for the 3DO that would upgrade its abilities using dual-power PC602 processors, in addition to newer 3D and video rendering technology. Price drops for the 3DO were announced in February of 1996 and perceived by the industry to be an effort to improve the 3DO's installed base before the M2 was released. The M2 project was originated by 3DO, and eventually, as 3DO sales stagnated and research and development funds ran short, they exited the hardware business and restructured the company to concentrate on developing their games for multiple platforms. At that point, they sold M2 to Matsushita, who originally claimed to be using the technology to create a new game console. However, in the end, they decided they didn't want to compete with Sony and canned the project altogether in 1997. Sadly, this all happened so close to its launch that there had even been marketing for the system, showing screenshots of Warp's D2, which later was rebuilt from the ground up and released on the Dreamcast. The M2 didn't die completely, though. Matsushita ended up using it for multimedia players aimed at professionals working in medicine, architecture, and sales, as well as a short-lived Konami arcade board. And the technology is still used today in vending and automated teller machines. But really though, it's a pretty sad ending to a console that was reportedly several more times powerful than the Nintendo 64. On a side note, development kits and prototypes of the M2 are valuable and sought after items among collectors today. So what are my thoughts on the 3DO? Well, the 3DO is one of the greatest underrated ahead of its time game consoles ever made, hands down. Its game library is packed with some fun titles that look great and offer hours of enjoyment. Honestly, Even the bad full-motion video games offer an interesting and fun way to explore the video game history of the early 90s. On top of that, the limited sales of this console will in the long run make it harder and harder to find and collect. So both as a system to play and one to invest in, it's well worth your purchase. You owe it to yourself to own a 3DO. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to subscribe to L1 Games on YouTube and check out nerdko.com, where you'll find lots more content just like this. Thanks for watching and have a great day.
CD로 즐기는 환상의 32비트 게임 3DO 얼라이브.
이야, 이거 영화야 게임이야.
이것부터 시켜요.
3차원 실감 영상, 충격의 CD 음향. 이것이 멀티미디어 게임이다.
이야,
금성 3DO 얼라이브.
단 1초도 방심할 수 없어요.